Some are saying that progressivism was on the ballot yesterday in both Los Angeles and San Francisco. Analysts predict that traditionally liberal voters in both Los Angeles and San Francisco may course correct rightward as their cities grapple with record high gas prices, the perception of rising crime, and the worsening homelessness crisis, as well as the sky-high cost of living.
In Los Angeles, an ex-Republican billionaire and real estate developer is an unlikely frontrunner for the Democratic mayoral ticket. Rick Caruso registered as a Democrat only 19 days before the first round of voting and has received the wildcard endorsement of Elon Musk and other celebrities, I believe Katy Perry, and outspent his opponent, Representative Karen Bass, 10-1 on a campaign based on, quote, cleaning up L.A.
In San Francisco, voters chose to recall District Attorney and criminal justice reformist Chesa Boudin by a reported 20-point margin. Critics blame his progressive policies for the city's inability to grapple with crime, homelessness, and addiction. Joining us now to weigh in on these races and what the outcomes mean for the progressive movement nationwide is Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief at NewsNation, Mike Viqueira. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, Brianna. Hi, Robbie. How are you guys?
We're doing well, thank you. So answer me this. Why is it that people in LA, a state that's known as perhaps the most densely populated Democratic state in the country, are so taken in by this person who we're calling a Democrat, but who obviously was not 19 days ago, and who has largely gotten himself on the board by using enormous sums of money in the way that Michael Bloomberg did in the presidential race to basically get on the playing field?
Well, right. I mean, and money's always a factor. It was a money in the mayoral primary that we're talking about right now in Los Angeles. It was a factor in the recall election of the district attorney in San Francisco as well. And as a matter of fact, Karen Bass and Boudin, Chesa Boudin, the district attorney in San Francisco, were vastly outspent. Having said that, you can't all lay it at the feet of, the billionaire class that's funding these drives to oust Boudin and to defeat Karen Bass, or at least self-fund defeat of Karen Bass in the case of Rick Caruso. I was talking to a Politico out there in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, someone who was actually on the ballot yesterday. And he was saying that when he talked to voters, when he was out canvassing and in all different kinds of neighborhoods, he was surprised. The top issues that he was talking about among Democratic constituencies that people were talking about were homelessness, crime, and perhaps to a lesser extent, the threat posed by Donald Trump and the movement, the MAGA movement, and everything that happened on January 6th. That was what is on people's minds. And I think that manifested itself in these races we saw in California. Bad news for Democrats all around in terms of turnout and nationwide in terms of more evidence that perhaps Donald Trump does not have the influence within his party that we all thought he might have heading into this election season. That's bad news for Democrats and perhaps good news for Republicans, because Democrats really want to run against Donald Trump. If he's not as visible, if the candidates they're running against aren't as aligned with Donald Trump as they might be, then that is a double blow for Democrats heading into the general election in November.
Right. Speaking of that, I was looking at an email I got this morning for the Nevada Democratic Senate candidate, and like the headline of the email is Donald Trump rally, whatever, tomorrow. And it doesn't even mention her opponent's name. It's all about, at first, it almost looks like it's actually an advertisement. It's targeting a Trump supporter and letting them know when the rally will be. But I think it speaks to a kind of out of touch quality that Democrats have. Certainly some of their base, some of the people they have to fire up are people who are just, solely motivated or largely motivated substantially by the fear of Donald Trump. And absolutely, you got to turn those people out. But that's not enough people. You got to turn out people who clearly are concerned about, rising crime across America and are just frankly do not seem to have faith in Democratic politicians or policies to deal with the crime and homelessness and those sorts of things.
Right. And, Robbie, and you and I have been doing this a long time. It's always the shoot the messenger, or the lack of the messenger, or we're not getting out there, or President Biden isn't using the bully pulpit. Things aren't looking up economically. And, we can blame the media for harping on gas prices, or we can talk about inflation seems to be tapering off, and Democrats better hope that it does in both of those cases over the course of the next few months heading into November. But When San Francisco votes overwhelmingly to reject and recall a district attorney who ran as a progressive prosecutor, to not be aggressive about relatively minor crimes or so-called victimless crimes, something that is sort of the catechism of the progressive movement. When San Francisco, the place where Nancy Pelosi faces a primary every election season because she's not progressive enough, when they vote to recall someone and it wasn't close, then something's going on. And when people see evidence of disorder around them, and perhaps experience rise in petty crime, if not in violent crime, then it manifests itself in the polls. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And as far as on the Republican side, Robbie, it's the revenge of the establishment. Look no further than South Dakota. Dusty Johnson, who voted, a member of the House, the at-large seat in South Dakota, voted to form the January 6th committee, who we'll hear from tomorrow night. And John Thune, who President Trump called a rhino. He's a member of Senate leadership, Mitch McConnell's best friend. That's not a compliment coming from Donald Trump. He won handily in his primary. There are other cases we could cite. And so, we're in a dynamic that is just not looking good for Democrats heading into November.
Well, we should be clear about a couple of things. A media review I was reading recently showed that most articles talking about crime in the area really emphasize the perception of crime. And that while that certainly is up, there's no indication that Chesa's tenure has led to a rise in crime actually in the state. Of course, Caruso was calling for 1,500 more police officers in the state, in the city, where 30% of the city's budget is already allocated toward the police. And there has been no demonstration that there's a correlation between the number of officers on the street and crime rates in LA. So I'm curious whether he is making an affirmative case for how he plans to address homelessness and some of these other issues that are on the concern of voters. I did see some reporting recently that showed that he hasn't really been out front much on the campaign trail, opting instead for one-on-one meetings and as opposed to giving speeches in which he might articulate a more substantive policy agenda. Is that right?
For the most part. I mean, again, this guy came out of nowhere, and 3 weeks ago he was a registered Republican. This is a recurring theme, and it's been this way since the midterms. Since the last election, when famously in the Richmond area down here just south of us, Abigail Spanberger took her Democratic colleagues to task for the defund the police movement, something that Democrats have been led by President Biden, have been trying to distance themselves from all along. So yes, it's a question of perception versus reality, but we're in a political arena and perception means a lot.
Yeah, and I don't know that it's just perception.
Politics.
There's homicides are up in LA, 50% from 2019. Car thefts are up 44%. Robberies involving firearms are up 60% in just the last, 2021 versus 2019.
Right. Well, there are a lot of those statistics that were also affected by 2020 and the lockdown, so that there was a big difference between year to year because of the big changes in people's behavior and the fact of people not being at work and in school and these other kinds of places. But when it comes to Chesa's prosecution record in particular, what people are saying is that it's not that crime rates have changed in particular, but he's being attacked over fewer prosecutions having taken place, which is exactly the promise of a progressive prosecutor, right? That there are a whole host of crimes, they have prosecutorial discretion, and there are a whole host of crimes that prosecuting them is a waste of taxpayers' money, doesn't actually reduce recidivism or cause any change in the crime rate. And there has been little to no evidence to suggest that Chesa's administration here is actually what's causing any of the changes in crime rates. And what people really have an appetite for is the idea of raising incarceration rates in a state that already has more incarcerated people than anywhere else in the country, and the largest incarcerated population, if it were its own country, in the world. So are those the kinds of conversations that are being had at all? Because my concern is when we do stay in the realm of talking about the perception of crime in these issues, then you do end up doing the work of the Conservative Party for them, buying into the initial premise. Well, I mean,
I don't live in California. I haven't seen the barrage of ads that voters there were inundated with. Evidently, it was enough, if nothing else, to suppress Democratic turnout across the board, across the state. Those discussions, all those points, Brianna, that you made have been brought up. We do know that. And that case was made by Chesa Boudin himself several times, as well as his allegation that this was funded, the drive to oust him was funded by billionaires. Be that as it may, people vote on the basis of their own personal experience a lot of times. A lot of times they don't. They vote on the basis of perception, on the basis of whatever tribe they happen to be involved, they adhere to, and that's just a symptom of the polarization that we're seeing. I would say, regardless of whether we call it perception or based on hard evidence, voters clearly are coming to their own conclusions about what they want to see happen and the insecurity they feel about what they see in terms of the homeless encampments and relatively minor crimes happening around them.
Karen Bass has made the argument that this runoff election is good for her, that ultimately there will be a much higher turnout after
That's
the runoff.
That's probably true, yeah.
And as a consequence, more settled Democratic voters will be out and will cast their votes for them. Is that wish casting, or do we think that's likely to be the outcome?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's a primary. Clearly, if you look at the turnout rates, Democratic voters in California took a lot for granted. Granted, it reflects a lack of motivation and enthusiasm, the so-called enthusiasm gap that we're seeing among Democrats across the country. But yeah, this will tend to surprise people. This will tend to focus people. You've already enunciated some of the things I think we can anticipate Karen Bass, the counter arguments she's going to be making to fight back this challenge from a late convert to the Democratic Party. And so, I think obviously, historically, and because of the reasons you outlined, because of the renewed focus on this race and the surprise factor, news is the unexpected, and now people are going to focus. I think that it probably could benefit her heading into November beyond.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
All right. Love to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have more Rising after this.